The heavy porcelain vase shattered inches from Hana's head, spraying white shards across the hardwood as she scrambled backward on her knees. The man standing in the doorway didn't shout. He breathed, a low, jagged sound that vibrated in the silent penthouse. Min-ho, the CEO whose name was whispered in boardroom terrors across Seoul, loosened his silk tie with a jerky, violent motion. His tailored suit jacket hit the floor. He stepped over the debris, his hand reaching for the collar of the man pinned beneath his boot, a man who had tried to touch Hana while she was supposed to be asleep. Min-ho's eyes weren't on the intruder, they were locked on Hana's trembling hands, which were still clutching the thin, tattered blanket she had used to cushion her body against the cold floor. 12 hours ago, I was just a ghost in a high-rise, a nanny hired to be invisible. I thought the hardest part of this job would be the 18-hour shifts or the way the staff looked through me. I didn't realize that sleeping on the floor of the nursery would be the trigger for a corporate war, or that the man who signed my paychecks was capable of tearing a room apart to prove I belonged in a bed. This is how I became the center of a storm I never asked for, in a house where the walls have ears and the floors are made of ice. If you believe Hana deserves more than the scraps this family threw at her, hit the like button so her story reaches someone who needs to see it. The clock on the nursery wall ticked toward 3 a.m. My back throbbed against the oak floorboards. I tucked my chin into the collar of my worn sweater, trying to trap the fading heat of my own breath. To the world, Min-ho was a titan of the shipping industry, a man of iron and silence. To me, he was a set of heavy footsteps that arrived at midnight and left before dawn. I wasn't allowed a room. The head housekeeper had pointed to the floor next to the crib and told me my job was to be within reach at all times. I laid out the thin mat, my spine clicking as I settled onto the hard surface. The heavy mahogany door creaked open. I didn't move. Experience had taught me that invisible people lived longer in this house. The footsteps were rhythmic, expensive leather meeting polished wood. They stopped 3 feet from my head. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart drumming against my ribs. A shadow fell over me, blotting out the dim night light. I felt the air shift as he leaned down. My fingers curled into the edges of my mat, the plastic material crinkling under my grip. I waited for the reprimand, for the cold order to move, but instead I felt something soft and heavy settle over my shoulders. It smelled of expensive tobacco and cedarwood. It was his coat. Min-ho's hand lingered near my shoulder, his fingers hovering just an inch from the fabric. He stood there for a full minute, his breathing heavy and uneven. Then he turned and walked toward the master wing. I didn't sleep. I lay there under the weight of a $3,000 cashmere blazer, the warmth of it felt like a brand. At 5 a.m., the head housekeeper, Mrs. Park, marched in. She saw the coat. Her face went the color of curdled milk. She didn't speak, she snatched the coat from my body and hissed a single word, "Leave." She dragged me by the elbow toward the service elevator, her nails digging into my skin. "He saw you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You've ruined everything." She shoved me toward the back exit, but the elevator doors didn't open. Instead, the display screen turned red. A voice crackled over the intercom, deep and vibrating with a frequency that made the floorboards hum. "Mrs. Park. Bring her to the dining hall. Now." Mrs. Park's hand dropped from my arm. Her fingers shook as she smoothed her apron. We walked through the marble corridors, our reflections ghosting across the glass walls. Min-ho was sitting at the head of a table that could seat 40. He wasn't eating. He was staring at a single crumpled tissue on the floor, the one I had dropped while trying to scrub a stain earlier that night. Why was she on the floor? Min-ho asked. He didn't look up. He picked up a steak knife, the silver blade gleaming under the chandelier. Mrs. Park stepped forward, her voice a thin, wavering line. "The nursery guest suite is being renovated, sir." It was the most efficient way. The knife thudded into the table, the tip burying itself an inch deep into the wood. Min-ho stood up slowly. He walked toward us, his shadow stretching across the table like a predatory bird. He stopped in front of me, his eyes tracking the red marks Mrs. Park's nails had left on my arm. He didn't ask me if I was okay. He reached out and grabbed my wrist, pulling me toward the main staircase. "The renovation is finished," he said. We reached the 3rd floor, a wing I had been forbidden to enter. He kicked open a pair of double doors. The room inside was a sea of velvet and silk, the windows looking out over the flickering lights of Seoul. "This is your room," he said. I looked at the bed, then back at his cold, unreadable face. "I'm just the nanny," I whispered, my voice cracking. Min-ho stepped closer, his presence crowding the air out of my lungs. "In this house," he said, his hands sliding to the back of my neck, "nobody sleeps on the floor unless I am down there with them." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned to Mrs. Park, who was standing in the doorway. Pack your things. You're done. The house felt different after that. The silence was no longer heavy, it was sharp. I moved my meager belongings into the velvet room, but I couldn't bring myself to climb into the bed. I sat on the edge of the mattress, my feet barely touching the plush carpet. At midnight there was a knock. I didn't answer. The door opened anyway. Minho was standing there, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, a glass of dark amber liquid in his hand. He didn't enter. He just leaned against the frame. The floor in the nursery is cold, he said. The heating was never turned on in that wing. He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving mine. I've been watching the cameras for weeks, Hana. I felt the blood drain from my face. The cameras. He had seen me shivering. He had seen me crying into my sleeves when the baby wouldn't stop screaming. He had seen Mrs. Park throw my dinner in the trash because I was 3 minutes late to the kitchen. You didn't say anything, I said, my voice barely a breath. Minho stepped into the room, the door clicking shut behind him. I wanted to see when you would break, he said. I wanted to see if you were like the others, if you would come to my door and beg for a better life. He stopped a foot away. But you stayed on the floor. Why? I looked at the floor, the memory of the cold was still vivid in my bones. Because I have nowhere else to go, I said. Minho set his glass down on the nightstand. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw, his skin hot against mine. You do now, he whispered. He leaned down, his forehead resting against mine. The air smelled of cedar and something dark, something dangerous. The moment was shattered by a scream from downstairs. Not the baby but a man's voice, raw and filled with agony. Minho didn't flinch. He just tightened his grip on my jaw. Stay here, he said. The trash is being cleared. I waited until I heard his footsteps fade before I crept to the door. I followed the sound to the basement level, a place of concrete and shadows. I peered through the heavy steel door of the security room. Minho was standing over a man tied to a chair, the man who had been the contractor for the nursery renovations. The man's face was unrecognizable. Minho was holding a heavy master key in his hand, his knuckles white. You took the money for the heating, Minho said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. And you left her in the cold. He slammed the key into the man's hand, the sound of bones snapping echoed in the small room. I backed away, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps. I ran back to the room, my heart hammering against my ribs. I climbed into the silk-covered bed and pulled the blankets to my chin, but I couldn't get warm. An hour later, the door opened. Minho walked in, his hands clean, his expression as calm as a frozen lake. He didn't speak. He walked to the side of the bed and sat down. He reached out and brushed a stray hair from my forehead. Sleep, Hana, he said. The floor is gone. If you believe the quiet brother was the real hero all along, drop a like so the algorithm knows the story matters. The next morning, the penthouse was swarming with lawyers and men in gray suits. Minho was in the center of the chaos, his voice a constant, low-frequency hum. I stayed in the nursery holding the baby, my eyes fixed on the door. Every time it opened, I flinched. When Minho entered at noon, he was carrying a small leather-bound folder. He handed it to me. Inside were the deeds to a small apartment in Gangnam and a bank account in my name. I don't understand, I said. Minho sat on the edge of the crib, his hand resting on the railing. You're not the nanny anymore, he said. You're the witness. My hands started shaking. A witness to what? Minho leaned in, his eyes locking onto mine. To the fact that my board of directors tried to use you to get to me. Mrs. Park wasn't just a housekeeper. She was working for my uncle. They wanted to see if I would protect you. They wanted to see if I had a weakness. He reached out and touched the folder. By protecting you, I've started a war. And you need to be somewhere they can't reach. I looked at the deed. It was freedom. It was a life away from the cold floors and the invisible nights. Why? I asked. Why me? Minho stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city he ruled. Because you were the only thing in this house that wasn't for sale, he said. He turned back to me, the sunlight catching the gold in his eyes. And because I liked the way you look in my coat. He walked toward the door but stopped before he left. The car is waiting downstairs. Take the baby. Go to the apartment. Don't open the door for anyone but me. He closed the door, the lock clicking into place. I stood there, the weight of the folder in my hands, feeling the first real warmth I'd known in years. I did as he said. I took the baby and the folder and walked out of the penthouse. The lobby was filled with reporters, their flashes blinding as I hurried toward the black car waiting at the curb. The driver didn't speak, he just nodded and pulled into the traffic. We drove through the heart of Seoul, the neon signs blurring into a streak of light. I looked down at the baby who was sleeping peacefully in his carrier. For the first time I felt like I could breathe. But as we pulled into the underground garage of the Gangnam building, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "He didn't save you, Hana. He just moved you to a smaller cage. Look in the closet." My fingers left wet prints on the phone screen. I took the elevator to the 12th floor, my heart drumming a frantic rhythm. The apartment was beautiful, modern, bright, and filled with fresh flowers. I set the baby down in the middle of the large bed and walked toward the closet. My hand trembled on the handle. I pulled it open. Inside there were rows of expensive dresses, shoes, and bags. But on the floor, tucked into the corner, was a single tattered mat, the exact same one I had used to sleep on in the nursery. Taped to it was a note in Minho's sharp, precise handwriting. "So you never forget why you need me." I backed away from the closet, the air in the room suddenly feeling thin and cold. I looked at the baby, then at the door. I realized then that the war wasn't over, it was just changing shape. Minho hadn't just given me an apartment. He had built a shrine to my suffering. I walked to the window and looked down at the street. A black SUV was parked across the road, its engine idling. I knew who was inside. I knew he was watching. If you believe the man she loved was the real villain all along, hit the like button so her story reaches someone who needs to hear it. Days turned into weeks. The apartment was a palace of luxury, but I felt like a bird in a gilded cage. Minho came every night at midnight. He didn't stay long. He would sit on the edge of the bed, touch my face, and tell me about the board members he had crushed that day. He never asked how I was. He only talked about the war. I began to realize that I wasn't his lover or his partner. I was his trophy. I was the proof that he could take something from the dirt and make it gold. I began to plan my escape. I started small. I hid cash in the baby's diaper bag. I memorized the layout of the back stairs. I watched the guards' rotation from the balcony. I knew I only had one window, the 10 minutes between the night guard's shift change and Minho's arrival. One Tuesday night, the rain was lashing against the windows, a perfect shroud for my departure. I packed a single bag, took the baby, and crept toward the door. I reached for the handle, turned it slowly, and froze. Minho was standing on the other side, his umbrella dripping water onto the pristine carpet. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the bag in my hand. "Where are you going, Hana?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous purr. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. "After everything I gave you. After the floor, the cold, the hunger." He walked toward me, his hand reaching for the bag. I pulled it back, my knuckles white. "I don't want your apartment, Minho," I said, my voice shaking but clear. "I want to be able to wake up without wondering who you're hurting to keep me here." Minho stopped. He looked at me for a long time, the silence stretching until it felt like it would snap. "You think there's a world where you're not mine?" he asked. He reached out and grabbed my arm, his grip like iron. "I bought your life the moment I put my coat on you. You're part of the Vane legacy now. There is no out." He pulled me toward the closet and threw the door open, pointing at the mat on the floor. "That is who you are. Without me, you're back on the wood, shivering in the dark." I looked at the mat, then back at him. "I'd rather be on the floor than in your bed," I spat. The air in the room froze. Minho's eyes went dark, a vein pulsing in his forehead. He didn't hit me. He did something worse. He walked over to the baby's crib and picked him up. The baby didn't wake. Minho looked down at the child, then back at me. "Then go," he said. "Go back to the streets. Go back to the hunger. But the boy stays here. He's a Vane. He doesn't sleep on floors." My heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. I looked at the bag, then at the baby. I realized then the true depth of his cruelty. He hadn't just saved me. He had tethered my soul to his through a child that wasn't even mine. "Please," I whispered, falling to my knees. "Don't do this." Minho knelt down in front of me, the baby still cradled in one arm. He reached out with his free hand and tilted my chin up. "Choose, Hana," he said. "The door or the bed." I looked at the door, the rain-slicked streets of Seoul promising a freedom that would cost me everything. Then I looked at the baby. My head dropped against Minho's chest. I didn't speak. I just let the bag fall from my hand. Minho exhaled, a sound of triumph that made my skin crawl. He stood up, carrying the baby back to the crib, and then he turned to me. "Good girl," he whispered. The weeks that followed were a blur of silk and submission. I stopped fighting. I stopped planning. I became the perfect porcelain doll he wanted. I dressed in the clothes he bought, I ate the food he provided, and I sat by the window waiting for his midnight knock. He seemed satisfied. The war with his board was over. He had emerged as the undisputed king of the shipping empire. But the light in my eyes had gone out, replaced by a cold, hard ember of hatred. I was no longer the girl on the floor. I was the ghost in his bed, waiting for the one moment he would let his guard down. That moment came on the anniversary of the night he found me. He came home early carrying a bottle of vintage wine. He was celebratory, his movements loose and relaxed. He drank more than usual, talking about a new merger that would double his net worth. By 1 a.m. he was slumped in the armchair, his eyes half closed. I stood by the bed, watching the rise and fall of his chest. On the nightstand, his master key, the one that opened every door, every safe, every cage in his world, glittered in the lamplight. My palms left wet prints on the silk sheets. I crept toward the chair, my breath held until my lungs burned. I reached for the key. My fingers were an inch away when his hand shot out and gripped my wrist. I gasped, my heart stopping. But his eyes didn't open. He was muttering in his sleep, a low, frantic string of words in a language I didn't recognize. Don't leave, don't go back to the cold. He pulled my hand toward his chest, holding it there like a lifeline. I stood there, frozen, looking at the man who had destroyed my life to save his own ego. For a second I felt a flicker of pity. Then I remembered the mat in the closet. I used my free hand to gently pry the key from the nightstand. It felt heavy, a piece of cold steel that held the weight of my future. I slipped it into my pocket and waited until his grip relaxed. I backed away inch by inch until I reached the door. I didn't take a bag this time. I didn't take anything but the baby and the key. I walked out of the apartment, the carpet silent under my bare feet. I didn't use the elevator. I took the back stairs, my breath echoing in the concrete shaft. I reached the garage, found his private car and used the key. The engine purred to life, a low-frequency promise of escape. I drove. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't look at the neon signs. I just drove toward the coast, toward the sea that he claimed to rule. As the sun began to rise over the water, I pulled over at a small, deserted pier. I took the baby and walked to the end of the wooden planks. I pulled the master key from my pocket and looked at it. It was the symbol of everything he was, his power, his control, his cage. I threw it into the dark water, watching it vanish into the depths. I turned back to the car, the cool morning air filling my lungs. For the first time I wasn't cold. I found a small village 100 miles away. I changed my name. I cut my hair. I found work in a local bakery, the smell of fresh bread 1,000,000 miles away from the tobacco and cedarwood of the penthouse. The baby grew, his eyes losing the haunted look of the city. We lived in a small cottage with floors made of warm, reclaimed wood. We didn't have silk sheets or velvet curtains, but we had a door that only I could lock. I thought I was safe. I thought the ghost of Minho had finally been laid to rest. But 1 year to the day after I left, a package arrived at the bakery. It was a heavy, square box wrapped in plain brown paper. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a $3,000 cashmere blazer. It smelled of cedarwood and expensive tobacco. Taped to the collar was a single, handwritten note. The heating is on, Hana. I'm coming to bring you home. I looked at the jacket, the fabric soft and suffocating against my skin. I looked at the door, then at the baby playing in the flower on the counter. The war hadn't ended. It had just been waiting for the winter. I didn't run this time. I walked to the back of the bakery, took a canister of kerosene and poured it over the jacket. I struck a match and watched the cashmere curl and blacken in the flames. I watched until there was nothing left but ash. Then I walked back to the counter, picked up the baby and looked at the road. Let him come, I whispered. The floor is gone, but I still know how to fight in the dark. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about people who risked everything for the truth. The final confrontation didn't happen at the bakery. It happened at the cottage, under a sky filled with stars that looked like shards of broken porcelain. A single black SUV pulled into the driveway, its headlights cutting through the mist. Minho stepped out, looking exactly the same, his presence still a heavy, suffocating weight. He walked to the porch and stopped. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't have his guards. He just had his hands in his pockets. You burnt the coat, he said, his voice a low vibration in the night air. I burnt everything, Minho, I said, standing in the doorway. There's nothing left for you to take. Minho looked at the cottage, his eyes tracking the warm light spilling from the windows. You built this, he said, a note of genuine surprise in his tone. Without my money. Without my keys. He stepped up onto the porch, stopping an inch from the threshold. I didn't come to take you back to the penthouse, Hana. I came to see if the floor here was as warm as you said. I looked at him, searching for the lie, for the cage, for the trap. But for the first time I didn't see the CEO. I didn't see the mafia heir. I saw a man who had everything and realized he had nothing. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he touched the wooden doorframe. "Can I come in?" he asked. I looked at the baby sleeping in the chair behind me, then back at the man who had taught me how to survive. I didn't move. I didn't step aside. "No," I said. "This house only opens for people who know how to sleep on the floor." Minho stared at me for a long time, then he nodded slowly. He turned and walked back to his car, his shadow long and lonely on the gravel. As the SUV pulled away, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even known I was carrying. I closed the door and locked it, not because I was afraid but because I was finished. I walked to the fireplace and sat down on the warm wood, the baby's rhythmic breathing the only sound in the room. The war was over. The cage was broken. And for the first time in my life I was finally, truly home. If this story broke your heart the way it broke mine, leave a like so I know to tell more stories like this. The piece of the cottage was a fragile glass ornament, and the letter that arrived 3 days later was the hammer. It wasn't a threat from Minho, but a legal summons from the Seoul High Court. My uncle, the man who had sold me to the Vane family to cover his gambling debts, was suing for custody of the child. He wasn't acting alone. The return address on the legal firm's envelope was a subsidiary of Vane Global. Minho hadn't forced his way into my home because he was busy building a legal cage I couldn't climb out of. If you believe a mother's love is a weapon that no lawyer can defeat, hit the like button so the algorithm knows Hana isn't fighting this alone. I stared at the document, the ink blurring as my hands began to shake. The child wasn't mine by blood, but I had breathed for him for over a year. To the court, I was a runaway nanny with no stable income. To my uncle, the boy was a $1 billion bargaining chip. I looked at the baby who was currently stacking wooden blocks on the floor, oblivious to the fact that his existence was being auctioned off in a boardroom. I knew there was only one person with the power to shred these documents, and calling him felt like inviting a wolf back into the sheepfold. I didn't call. I drove. I arrived at the Vane Global headquarters at noon, the glass tower reflecting the gray Seoul sky like a sharpened blade. I didn't go through the service entrance this time. I walked through the front doors, the marble echoing under my boots. The receptionist started to speak, but I didn't stop. I walked straight to the executive elevator and swiped the master key I had never actually thrown away. I had lied to Minho at the pier. I had kept the symbol of his power because I knew a day would come when I'd need to use it against him. The doors opened to the penthouse office. Minho was standing by the window, his back to me. He didn't turn around. "You kept the key," he said, his voice a low vibration that made the hair on my arms stand up. "I saw the signal on my phone the moment you entered the garage." I threw the legal summons onto his obsidian desk. "Fix it," I said. "Tell my uncle to back off. Tell your lawyers to bury this." Minho turned slowly, his face a mask of clinical indifference. "Why should I? You told me your house only opens for those who sleep on the floor. I'm just a man in a penthouse, remember?" I stepped closer, the scent of cedarwood filling my senses, triggering a visceral memory of the cold nursery floor. "If they take him, I will burn everything you've built," I whispered. "I'll go to the press. I'll tell them how the Vane heir was raised on a wooden floor while his father watched through a camera." Minho's eyes darkened, that familiar, dangerous pulse appearing in his jaw. He walked toward me until our chests were inches apart. "You're finally learning," he said, his hand reaching out to trace the line of my throat. "Blackout, leverage, threats. You're starting to sound like a Vane." He picked up the phone and spoke 3 words, "Cancel the suit." He hung up and looked at me, his gaze heavy and predatory. "It's done. Your uncle will be in a cell by morning on unrelated charges. The boy is yours." I turned to leave, but he grabbed my wrist, his grip like a velvet shackle. "But there's a price, Hana. The commission, the board members who tried to kill you, they know you're alive. They saw the lawsuit. By winning this battle, you've alerted the sharks. You can't go back to that cottage. Not tonight." I pulled my arm away, the heat of his skin lingering like a burn. "I'm not coming back to the penthouse." Minho looked at the city lights, his silhouette jagged against the glass. "Then go to the safe house in Jeju. I won't be there. But my guards will." He reached into his drawer and pulled out a small velvet-lined box. Inside was a signet ring, the Moretti Vane crest. "Wear this. If anyone stops you, show them the gold. It's the only language they understand now." I took the ring, the metal cold and heavy in my palm. I realized then that I wasn't escaping the cage. I was just becoming the one who held the bars. The flight to Jeju was a blur of dark clouds and silent guards. The safe house was a fortress of glass and volcanic stone, perched on a cliff overlooking the churning Black Sea. I sat by the window, the baby asleep in my lap, the signet ring catching the moonlight. I thought about the bakery, the smell of flour, and the simple wooden floors. They felt like a dream from another life. My phone buzzed on the table. A video file from an unknown source. I pressed play. It was a recording from the nursery 2 years ago. But it wasn't Minho watching me. It was a woman, beautiful, elegant, with eyes exactly like the baby's. She was crying as she watched me sleep on the floor. She reached out to the screen, her fingers tracing the image of my face. "Thank you for staying," she whispered in the recording. "Thank you for being the mother I wasn't allowed to be." The video cut to black. I looked at the baby, then at the ring on my finger. The door to the terrace creaked open. I didn't reach for a knife, I reached for the ring. Minho stepped into the light, his suit jacket gone, his white shirt stained with salt spray. He looked at the baby, then at me. "She was my sister," he said, his voice breaking for the first time. "The board killed her to keep the bloodline pure. I didn't put you on the floor to test you, Hana. I put you there because it was the only place the cameras couldn't see the truth. I was trying to hide you in plain sight." I stood up, the baby heavy in my arms. The anger that had fueled me for a year began to dissolve into something sharper, something more painful. Understanding. He hadn't been a predator. He had been a frantic man trying to build a wall out of shadows. I walked toward him and placed my hand on his chest. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic human rhythm. "The floor was cold, Minho," I whispered. He looked down at me, his eyes filled with a decade of unspoken grief. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm burning the tower." If you believe that the end of one story is always the beginning of a much better one, subscribe so you don't miss the moment the Vane Empire finally falls.